Many Christians adapt to the character and behavior pattern of Christians around them. But God hasn't called us to be like those around us. He has called us to be like Himself. Holiness is nothing less than conformity to the character of God.
This is Mission 66, brought to you by TWR and the Bible teaching ministry of Dr. Luis Sayao. Today, we're stepping into 2 Samuel, offering timeless lessons of repentance, justice, mercy, and relying on God's guidance. You can follow along with your downloadable study guide at mission66.org. Here's John Matthews with Esther Sisulu to guide our study.
Welcome to the continuation of our journey in the Bible, where the Old Testament and the New Testament are considered one complete work. Why? Well, that's because it's the same God, and the Old is the foundation for the New. And of course, we can learn so many lessons from the mistakes as well as the successes of the people in ancient times. Well, as we turn to the Old Testament book of 2 Samuel today, looking at chapter 6, our teacher, John Matthews, will present the theme, Respecting God's Holiness.
Esther, thank you so much, and a very warm welcome to this latest episode of Mission 66. Wherever you join us from today, you are so welcome here, and it's great to be with you. And here we are, we're seeing the rise of David as Israel's second king, and his reign is covered here in this book of 2 Samuel. And in chapter 5, we saw David consolidate his leadership first over the tribe of Judah and then over all the tribes of Israel. And we saw, didn't we, that there's something that maybe hasn't been among the Israelites much in their history at all to this point. There is this great strength now in unity. I heard the expression, a house divided cannot stand, but a house united can do almost anything. So what happens now then as we reach chapter 6? Well, we find this chapter mainly focuses on the Ark of the Covenant, otherwise known as the Ark of God. What is the Ark of God? Well, let me remind you, if you're just joining us on Mission 66 for the first time, great to have you here, by the way. Well, the Ark of God was this wooden box plated in gold leaf. It's covered with a lid that was called the mercy seat, and on that mercy seat were these two cherubim figures facing each other. Inside the ark, three items that have been so important in the history of Israel. Two stone tablets on which God Himself had inscribed the 10 Commandments, written by His very finger when He was with Moses there on Mount Sinai. There was also a jar there containing manna, which was the supernatural food which God had supplied for the Hebrews as they wandered through the wilderness, the desert, on their way to the promised land. Remember, it took them in the end, mainly because of their disobedience. It took them 40 years. And then there was one other thing, which was a staff that was carried by Moses' brother Aaron, that had blossomed, if you remember that story, into almond flowers, demonstrating that Aaron was the one who is to be head of the tribes of the priests, and the Aaronic priesthood was carried on through his forefather Levi. That is, Levi was the tribe who was designated as the tribe to be priests, serving in the tabernacle. But of course, not all Levites were priests. We know that. But Aaron and his sons happened to be the Levites picked by God to hold the office as priest. Now, you might remember that this ark had been captured by the Philistines back in 1 Samuel chapter 7. And now, because it wasn't where it was supposed to be in that story, this ark has caused great havoc and suffering upon the Philistines whilst they'd taken or kidnapped it, whilst it was in their possession. So the Philistines were scared stiff. They were greatly terrified, and they figured, this ark is causing terrible problems among us, so we'd better send it back to Israel. And they did that on this cart that was drawn by oxen. And Israel was certainly glad to have that ark back. And then it was stored at the house of a man called Abinadab. But now David intends to strengthen the unity of the people and indeed their worship of the one true God. And to do that, David plans to bring the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem, which was the newly established capital for Israel. And the Ark was to be brought from the house of Abinadab to Jerusalem. Let's see what happens as the Ark is being transported to Jerusalem here in chapter 6. David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000 of them. And David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Judah to bring up from there the Ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned on the cherubim. And they carried the Ark of God on a new cart, and they brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the Ark of God. And Ahio went before the Ark. And David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. And David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. And when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah put out his hand to the Ark of God and took hold of it, because the oxen had stumbled. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down there because of his error, and he died there beside the Ark of God. And David was angry because the Lord had broken out against Uzzah, and that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. And David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, "How can the Ark of the Lord come to me?" So David was not willing to take the Ark of the Lord into the city of David, but David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And the Ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months. And the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. And we see David here, don't we, distraught over the death of his friend Uzzah, now in great fear, wondering, well, what did he do wrong? What did I do wrong? So there was this time of bewilderment with David wanting to honor God by bringing the ark into the capital Jerusalem, but now fearing that he'd be struck down, wonders whether he's made the wrong call. As a result, he has the ark taken to a guy called Obed-Edom, who was willing to risk his life, it seemed at the time, because there was fear around the ark, by having it at his place for 3 months. But to Obed-Edom's own delight and pleasant surprise, the ark proved not to be a curse, but a blessing to him in that time. And verse 12 says, "It was told King David, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God." So David went up and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. And when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and a fattened animal. And so David here is learning the depth of God's holiness. There's only so much any human can fully appreciate or understand God's holiness, but he's certainly learning through this experience to respect God's holiness. In his soul searching, David evidently researches the Bible as they had it in this time to find out what the proper way was to transport the ark. Maybe that was something that was possibly overlooked in that story with Uzzah, and it wasn't to be treated, the ark of God, like maybe people might treat baggage at the bus station or something like that. There was need for this deep respect for the holiness of God, We'll also understand as we look, as David researched, that the ark wasn't to be put on a wagon that was pulled by oxen. It was to be transported on the shoulders of priests. And so you might think, well, this was a bit harsh on Uzzah. Certainly David thought that same thought. So you're in good company if you thought that. And I'm sure he didn't intend to show disrespect when he reached out to steady the ark, but it was a mistake nonetheless, because the transporting of the ark was not done in accordance with the instructions in the Word of God. And so how was it to be transported? Well, the answer is found in Numbers chapter 4, because first of all, the ark was to be transported on 2 poles, used for that specific purpose, and placed on the shoulders of men from the tribe of Levi, the priestly tribe. It says that nobody was to touch the ark itself, or indeed any of the holy things in the sanctuary, lest they die. So once David was able to bring things in line with what the scriptures said, the ark was able to be moved appropriately. He didn't have to sacrifice animals along the way. That was voluntary on his part, I guess, thinking, I want to just make sure I do it right this time. And once he realizes that God's not angry, it's just that he requires the transporting of the ark to be done a certain way because of his holiness. And it's a reflection, isn't it, of the importance of listening to God. Well, David is eager to do it, and he's able to rejoice in it. And then verse 14 tells us that, because it says that David danced before the Lord with all of his might. And David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the horn. And as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. You see that? Michal, far from completely at one with David, she remains a daughter of Saul at heart, and she despises this display of joy-filled worship that David cannot keep, but from showing and giving out his entire self to God in this moment, physically and dancing, and it's a joyous moment. But Michal has a different heart. And verse 17 says, and they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And when David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts, and distributed among all the people, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins to each one. Then all the people departed, each to his house. And David returned to bless his household. But Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David, saying, how the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself before the eyes of his servants, female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. And David said to Michal, it was before the Lord, who chose me above your father and above all his house, to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord. And I will celebrate before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in your eyes. But by the female servants of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honour. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. So there is a division there, isn't there? And this point of departure is that David is a worshipper of God and is joyful in his worship and will worship with all his might. And then you have Michal, who is not. You can imagine the scene, can't you? This incredible grand celebration as the ark is transported from Obed-Edom's house to Jerusalem. There's singing, there's dancing, this joyous display of noise and happiness. And it almost seems impossible for there to be someone who's not happy, but Michal is that person. And the chapter shows us that God's holiness is sometimes fatal to unrepentant people. His word is to be obeyed, but not in a draconian way, because that is the way that brings us freedom. And God moved in the hearts and the minds of holy men to have the Bible written just exactly as he wanted it to be. And everything that he does is done for such good reason, whether we realize or whether we can discern or understand a bit of that or not. Because ultimately, God doesn't need our help. Uzzah attempted to provide some help. It wasn't done right, though the whole thing wasn't done right. And often when we act outside of God's guidance and still try to help, again, Saul comes to mind, we ignore his holiness. We're trying to do it our own way. We're a bit flippant about those things. We lose perspective of who God really is. And in doing so, we may encounter God's discipline. He is the Lord God Almighty. He is awesome. He is full of awe. He is beyond description. He's too overwhelmingly holy for any human eye to cope with. And yet, he's also the friend who sticks closer than a brother. But here, we witness the power and the purity of God's holiness. And it needs to be deeply respected and revered. Maybe something in our modern day that we don't see much of, that doesn't come very easily to us. And it certainly didn't happen here, not initially. And it's sad to say that often it doesn't happen in our churches either. And maybe this is one of the reasons that God withholds his blessing. Maybe it's because we are culturally holy rather than really holy. Jerry Bridges once said this: many Christians have what we might call a cultural holiness. They adapt to the character and the behavior patterns of Christians around them, doing things their way. But God hasn't called us to be like those around us. He's called us to be like himself. Holiness is nothing less than conformity to the very character of God.
You're listening to Mission 66 with our teacher, John Matthews, and of course, I'm your host, Esther. Now, Mission 66 is able to reach listeners around the world in multiple languages, and that's because of your prayers and financial partnership with this ministry. Thank you so much, dear friend. Now, if you'd like to give a gift to the ministry, I'd invite you to visit mission66.org. That's mission66.org. Well, of course, today's lesson is from 2 Samuel verse 6. And here we see David, who is freshly anointed as king. And he's seeking to bring the ark of God into Jerusalem. But I think we also see here that he was a little frustrated with what had happened to his friend Uzzah, who only wanted to steady the ark from falling off the ox cart. But we find that he was, struck dead by God. Now, John, I think we've seen a few instances like this in the Bible that have led us to ask the question whether God was being a little too harsh or dealing harshly with a particular matter. So I guess once again, in this case, what do you think? Was God being a bit too harsh?
No, I think the key point here is understanding what is truly important to God, but it's more than that. It's human beings understanding that God's holiness is just incredible. And the word incredible doesn't even do it any justice whatsoever. So we have no idea how magnificently awesome his holiness is, so much so that we can't look upon it. And so, David is frustrated here at what happens. But God's response to Uzzah's action is not arbitrary. It's a reminder of the seriousness of his holiness. God had made clear in the law of Moses that his holiness comes first and that those who disregard it would face consequences, even if it was well-meaning or accidental, as it was in the case of Uzzah. And yeah, David's disillusioned with God at this point, believing him too harsh. But when the Lord blessed Obed-Edom because he was willing to store the ark of God at his place, at his home, David sees the side of God that is full of mercy and reason. Obed-Edom's not struck down, possibly because he respects God's holiness. And then David investigates. And I say and then because you think that probably should have been done before. But he does investigate and he finds out how God wanted the ark to be transported. He was glad to take the ark, wasn't he, back to Jerusalem, this time doing it the right way, borne on the shoulders of the priest, done to the sound of music, praise, sacrifice, and dance. But I think the holiness of God reflects to us the seriousness of sin as well. And maybe we can take that a little lightly or try to get around it our way. But the seriousness of sin is eternal and it's horrendous. And there is a consequence. And God is perfect and he's holy. And so there is fear within that, and it's a right fear. Because if we don't know God and we don't know his saving grace and his love, then that is something that we have to face, and that is a fearsome thought. And so God's holiness is, it is so important, and it's so much a part of who he is, and it makes him perfect. And God wouldn't be God if he wasn't perfect.
100%, yeah. Well, let's talk about what the text means when it says that David became afraid of God.
Well, Esther, an old friend of mine once taught me that a chainsaw is a useful tool. It enables us to cut things we don't want away. It enables us to make firewood. But I remember him cautioning me once to be ultra respectful of a chainsaw and a little bit afraid of what it could do. And I think the same is true of God. And maybe that's an uncomfortable thing for us to hear. Yes, he's perfect love. Yes, he's perfect compassion. He can be your saviour, your guide, your provider, your counsellor, your ever-present help in time of trouble. He's the friend who sticks closer than a brother. But he's more than that. And maybe we should just briefly travel to the pages of C.S. Lewis's brilliant series of books. They were called The Chronicles of Narnia. And there, in one of those books, it's called The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. By the way, the Chronicles of Narnia reflect the themes and the stories of the Bible. And in those stories, you have this lion, and the lion is called Aslan, and he represents God. And in it, there's a young girl called Lucy who asks the question before meeting Aslan, is Aslan safe? To which comes the reply, of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king. What an answer. And ultimately, he is our ultimate place of refuge and strength. But he's at the same time holy and perfect purity reveals our deep imperfection. And so you have our mass media, sometimes our entertainment, even some of our churches encourage this kind of familiarity towards God. God wants to know us and be the friend that sticks closer than a brother, but He wants us to know him in his fullness, not in the way, the partial way that some like to present him. So you may hear him referred to in loose and careless ways. Maybe some of you loose and careless with the use of his name even. The fear of God, you see, Esther, it's not one of terror or cringing before him, but rather this holy thankfulness that produces a reverence and awe when we realize what he is saving us from. And when we start to get that, we start to acknowledge, and only then can we, how awesome God really is.
That really resonated with me. It's so powerful. God's holiness. Wow. Well, there is something quite interesting that the text brings up, and it's about David, who was dancing before the Lord, and he was wearing that linen ephod. Now, it seems to me that he was wearing something that only the priests should wear, and, kind of doing the same thing that King Saul was faulted for doing a couple of years earlier. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a good spot. Again, Esther, and verse 14 mentions that he's wearing this linen ephod. It seems similar, but actually it's not, because he's wearing a type of priestly garment, but it's not the ephod that is reserved exclusively for priest, which included the Urim and the Thummim stones. For instance, we see that Samuel, as a little child in 1 Samuel chapter 2, he wore this type of garment as someone serving in the temple. But it's not the same ephod as the priests wore. So David's merely participating in this holy celebration, but certainly not overstepping into a prohibited role. We know that the priests were doing what they were supposed to do in carrying the ark.
Something else that we see in the scene is David's wife, Michal, who was very critical of his behavior when he was dancing before the ark in the procession. And I think naturally you would do so in praise to God when you acknowledge his goodness, right? But I do wonder if perhaps maybe she didn't have a point, because when you think about the demeanor of a king, this display may have been a little unrefined, or maybe considered coarse behavior. Just an observation on this, John.
I wonder what you and I will do when we see King Jesus, Esther. What will we do? Impossible, isn't it, to imagine or answer? And I imagine we'll certainly bow in awe and reverence. But I imagine that at some point too, that the joy unspeakable will cause us, like David, to dance with everything within our being, to his glory and to his love and to his praise. The word for dance here actually conveys an idea of spinning or twirling. And the moment had been a long, long time coming. And I think it's a really encouraging verse to see that, David gives his all, and he's not afraid to. He's not afraid for his huge love for God to be seen. In fact, it's pretty courageous in some ways. And David is overjoyed that the ark is coming home. And one day Jesus will be overjoyed when we arrive at home.
The heartwarming thought when we'll be dancing with Jesus when we get home. Just in continuation with David dancing before the Lord, the text kind of seems to hint that he was partially undressed when he was doing this.
No, what it actually is implying is that he's not wearing his kingly robes as Michal might have expected, and certainly would have seen her own dad Saul wear on many occasions. David was acting, I suppose, without royal attire. He had what might be described as common attire on, ordinary clothing, including the ephod. So when Michal says, uncovering yourself before the eyes of servant girls, she's really saying removing your royal robe in front of the servant girls, which culturally, that would have been quite something, but certainly no hint of anything untoward there. And we see David responding to her criticism saying, look, I'm just humbling myself before the people, and that he would continue to be a king ruling in humility, not as some high and mighty potentate.
That's fantastic. Thanks, John. Well, we've come to one of my favorite parts of the episode, and that is getting the chapter summary.
Yeah, let's do that, Esther. Here we have David, don't we? Freshly anointed King of Israel, and now retrieving the Ark of the Covenant, resolving to bring it to Jerusalem. But it's carried on this ox cart led by two men called Uzzah and Ahio. But the celebration with music and rejoicing, it's cut short because Uzzah touches the ark to steady it because the oxen have stumbled. And this act is seen as impious by God. And so Uzzah is struck down, and David is two things. He's angry and he's also afraid. And so he temporarily places the ark in the home of Obed-Edom while he thinks about how to bring this ark to Jerusalem. He's not quite sure what to do next. And during the time, he seeks help from the scriptures. And during that time, he learns the right way to transport the ark. And that right way was on the shoulders of priests. He also notices how God is blessing the house of Obed-Edom during the ark's, what ended up being a 3-month stay there. And so this encourages him to bring the ark to Jerusalem, try a second time, and this time do it the right way, which he does with great joy. And along the way, sacrifices are made. Here's David, he's wearing this linen ephod, dancing before the Lord in celebration. And the ark is then finally placed in a tent that David had prepared, and he blesses the people, distributing food to the multitude before they returned home. However, what happens? His wife, Michal, Saul's daughter, despises him for what she perceives as undignified behavior. David responds saying, "My actions are an expression of my love for God, of my worship for him who's chosen me of all people as king over Israel." And he declares that he's going to humble himself even further in his devotion to God, regardless of Michal's disapproval. And so, what a chapter where we see themes of reverence, worship, humility, and the consequence of both honouring and dishonouring God's holiness.
We'll leave it today for Mission 66. Thank you for joining us for today's episode. Hey friend, one way that you can be a part of the Mission 66 community is by following us on our social media networks. That's on Facebook and on Instagram. Now, while you're there, you can leave a comment or perhaps leave a question on any episode that may have interested you. And you can also learn about upcoming episodes. Just go to Facebook or Instagram and type in the search line Mission 66. And as always, we look forward to interacting with you on our social media platforms. Well, friend, we look forward to introducing you to yet another chapter through the book of 2 Samuel. So please join us next time right here on Mission 66.
As Mission 66 comes to a close, be sure to download your free study guide at mission66.org. Deepen your daily devotion with insights from each episode, and let John and Esther lead you through the scriptures. Get your study guide at mission66.org and be prepared for our next episode. There, you can also connect with us, ask questions, or donate to help Mission 66's worldwide outreach. Head to mission66.org. Mission 66 is made possible through Transworld Radio in partnership with Dr. Luis Sayao.